Today, April 22nd, 2026. We're around in a secure compound in Northwood, northwest London. Inside the facility known as the Permanent Joint Headquarters, the military nerve center from which Britain coordinates its most sensitive overseas operations, naval officers from more than 30 countries sat down around a planning table to discuss the most consequential maritime operation the world has needed since the Allied minesweeping convoys of the Second World War, and the deliberate economic pressure campaigns that defined the first term and then returned with intensified focus and broadened scope in the essay, Econ. What the American media establishment chose to characterize as chaos, impulsiveness, and a dangerous disregard for the complexity of international affairs was, in reality, something considerably more uncomfortable for that establishment to acknowledge, which was a coherent, patient, and methodically constructed long game aimed with precision at the Islamic Republic of Iran. The results of that long G game are now arriving in a sequence that is accelerating faster than the critics anticipated. This is the story of a Monday morning that changed the rules of the game. At exactly 10 o'clock Eastern Time on April 13th, 2026, the United States Navy began enforcing a naval blockade of all maritime traffic, entering and exiting Iranian ports and coastal areas. Not a threat, not a Truth Social post, not an ultimatum with a countdown clock, an operational blockade, announced by CENTCOM in formal military language, effective at a precise time, enforced by the carrier strike groups of the USS Gerald R. Ford and the USS Abraham Lincoln and the destroyers and frigates and amphibious vessels and Coast Guard. D-cutters that have been positioned throughout the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea for 43 days of the most intensive American naval deployment since the Gulf War. Iran's armed forces responded within hours. They called the imposition of restrictions on vessel movement in international waters an illegal act amounting to piracy. The IRGC Brigadier General Hossein Mohebi warned that Iran could unveil new military capabilities and new forms of warfare that opponents would have limited ability to counter. The IRGCV owed that any military vessel approaching the blockade perimeter would be dealt with severely. And somewhere in the Persian Gulf, in the 40-mile-wide A waterway that has been the center of the global economy's single worst crisis in decades, the blockade that nobody believed Trump would actually implement is in effect. The unthinkable has happened. What Iran challenged, and what the Pentagon's response revealed, is more important than the blockade itself as a diplomatic or military instrument. Iran has been running what amounts to a selective permission system through the Strait of Hormuz since the ceasefire took effect on April 7th. Ships from China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan were allowed passage in favorable terms. Ships from American allies in Europe and Asia faced restriction, tolling requirements, or refusal. Iran's message to the world was explicit in the actions, even when it was sometimes implicit in the words, "The Strait of Hormuz is now an instrument of Iranian foreign policy, and the price of access is alignment with, or at minimum, non-opposite ion to Iranian interests." This is what J.D. Vance described on Fox News Monday morning as economic terrorism against the entire world. They basically threatened any ship moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Vance's framing, too, can play at that game, is the stated logic of the blockade. If Iran will operate Hormuz as a toll booth and a political filter, America will operate it as nothing at all until Iran agrees to operate it as an international waterway. The Pentagon's unthinkable action is the counterweapon that mirrors the weapon Iran built. Here is why Saudi Arabia's pipeline move is more important than anything happening in the Strait right now. Iran's entire negotiating strategy was built on one assumption, that closing Hormuz would cause so much economic pain that America would eventually give Iran what it wants. Sanctions lifted, nuclear program protected, Hormuz under Iranian control. Iran thought it had the world hostage. But Saudi Arabia's pipeline move undermined that strategy. Because if oil can flow without going through Hormuz, Iran's leverage shrinks. Every barrel that flows through the petrol lane is one less barrel that the world desperately needs through Hormuz. Every barrel that flows through ADCOP reduces Iran's bargaining power. CNN reported there are about 400 loaded oil tankers in the Gulf waiting to get out, but the pipeline routes are providing crucial relief to global markets while those tankers wait. And now, with America's naval blockade starting today, the pipeline strategy becomes even more critical. Trump announced America will blockade all ships entering or leaving Iranian ports. Targeting Iran's oil exports completely. Saudi Arabia's pipeline gives the world an alternative supply route. Iran gets squeezed from both sides, America blockading Iranian exports, Saudi Arabia bypassing the Strait entirely. The economic pressure on Tehran has never been higher. But there is one risk that nobody in mainstream media is covering. What happens if Iran targets the pipeline? Iran has already conducted drone strikes on Duqm and Salalah, alternative shipping ports in Oman that ships were using to bypass Hormuz. Iran has shown it is willing to attack infrastructure beyond Hormuz. The petroline runs 750 miles across Saudi Arabia. It cannot be hidden. It cannot be moved. And Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has already threatened to open new fronts in places where the enemy is most vulnerable. A pipeline running across open desert, pumping 7 million barrels per day, is exactly the kind of target that changes the war if it gets hit. One successful Iranian drone strike on the petroline would collapse Saudi Arabia's bypass strategy instantly, spike oil prices back toward $150 per barrel overnight, potentially drag Saudi Arabia into direct military conflict, and turn a US-Iran war into a Gulf-wide catastrophe. This is the specific risk that Saudi Arabia's pipeline strategy carries, and why the next few weeks are the most dangerous of this entire conflict. Saudi Arabia did something huge. While America negotiated and threatened, Saudi Arabia built an economic escape route for the entire world. 750 miles of pipeline, 7 million barrels per day, quietly turned on at full power while nobody was watching. It reduced Iran's leverage, it stabilized global oil markets, it gave the world's economy a lifeline, but it also created a new target. And Iran, desperate, blockaded, and under maximum economic pressure, is now looking at that pipeline the same way it looked at those ships in the Strait. The next 48 hours will tell us whether Saudi Arabia's quiet power holds, or becomes the next flashpoint in a war that keeps finding new ways to escalate. Subscribe right now, because we cover every development as it happens. Hit subscribe, hit the bell. I will see you in the next one. While the world was watching America and Iran fight over the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia was quietly doing something nobody expected. Not a military move, not a diplomatic statement, a pipeline. A 750-mile pipeline running across the Saudi desert, that just became the most important piece of infrastructure on planet Earth. And when Saudi Arabia turned it on at full power, it changed everything. The world's oil supply, the war's economics, Iran's leverage, all of it shifted in one move that nobody in Washington saw coming. This is the story of how Saudi Arabia played the smartest card of this entire war. Subscribe right now, because this is the angle nobody else is covering. Now let's get into it. To understand what Saudi Arabia did, you need to understand the problem first. On February 28th, America and Israel attacked Iran. Iran's response was immediate. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. The strait carries 20 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade, primarily from Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iraq, and Qatar. All of it blocked overnight. Oil prices exploded. Global benchmark. Brent crude rallied to nearly $120 a barrel at the start of the conflict. The Gulf states were in crisis. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, suddenly could not export its oil. 400 loaded oil tankers were stuck inside the Gulf, waiting, going nowhere. Every day the strait stayed closed, Saudi Arabia lost billions. The world economy was bleeding, and everyone was looking at America and Iran, waiting for a deal. But Saudi Arabia did not wait. Most people have never heard of the petroline, but right now, it is the most important pipeline on Earth. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, known as Petroline, is a roughly 750-mile system that transports crude across Saudi Arabia, connecting the oil-rich eastern Gulf Coast to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. This pipeline was built decades ago, specifically for this kind of emergency, a way to bypass the Strait of Hormuz completely. No Iran, no IRGC, no blockade, just oil flowing west, across the desert, to the Red Sea, and straight to the world. And here is what Saudi Arabia did that nobody expected. Where the east-west pipeline had been transferring an average of 770,000 barrels per day in January and February, Saudi Arabia cranked it up to its full capacity of 7 million barrels per day by the end of March. 7 million barrels per day, almost 10 times the normal flow. In just 1 month, Saudi Arabia quietly rerouted its entire oil export system away from the Strait of Hormuz. No press conference, no announcement, no drama, just oil flowing, while the world was watching the war. And Saudi Arabia was not alone. The UAE activated its Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, known as AIDCOP, which allows crude exports to bypass the strait via the port of Fujairah on the Arabian Sea. 2 pipelines, 2 countries, both routing oil away from Iran's blockade. Together, these 2 pipelines were partially replacing the 20 million barrels per day that normally flow through Hormuz. Not completely, but enough to stabilize global markets, enough to prevent the full economic catastrophe that a complete Hormuz closure would have produced. Energy analysts at Kepler confirmed Saudi Arabia and the UAE are already increasing utilization of pipelines that bypass the strait. This is what strategic infrastructure looks like in action. Built years ago, maintained quietly, activated in the exact moment the world needed it. And America had not planned for this, Trump was focused on the military solution, the blockade, the negotiations, the threats. Saudi Arabia was focused on the economic solution, the pipeline, the rerouting, the quiet victory. The operational order was signed at 6 minutes past midnight. Not the specific executive communication whose deliberate public timing the standard White House communications architecture deploys when the announcement's content requires the particular media cycle management that daytime releases produce as the minimum institutional framing opportunity, whose use the operational urgency. The theater command's assessment, communicated, had eliminated. Not the specific advance notice whose delivery the Allied government's diplomatic channels normally receive before the American executive's major strategic decisions become the public record whose consequences their institutional responses must manage. Signed at 6 minutes past midnight with the particular operational urgency whose communication the timing itself produces as the minimum signal that what the order authorized was not the policy announcement whose preparation the standard review process accommodates, but the operational authorization whose execution the theater command required as the foundational enabling decision. Trump sealed Hormuz. The specific operational meaning whose honest characterization requires engaging with what sealed actually means when the American president authorizes the particular naval operation whose execution converts the world's most strategized Cali important waterway from the contested commercial corridor whose transit every major energy-dependent economy requires into the specific managed passage whose terms the American Naval Authority determines as the operational reality. For 6 weeks, the world watched the Strait of Hormuz stay close-ed and assumed that only one thing could open it. An America-end military operation, a NATO naval force, some kind of over-W helming Western pressure that would force Iran to back down. That was the assumption in Washington. That was the assumption in London, and Brussels, and Tokyo. Everyone was poking at the same playbook. The one where America solves the problem with force or the threat of force and the world goes back to normal. But Saudi Arabia was quietly doing something that no one in Washington had anticipated, that no intelligence briefing had flagged as a serious possibility, and that when it became clear what had actually happened, left American officials scrambling to understand the implications of a move they had not seen coming and could not have stopped EV-N if they had. Saudi Arabia did not fire a missile. It did not deploy a fleet. It did not make a dramatic announcement or call a press conference. It met a deal. A specific, calculated, and extraordinarily consequential deal that removed the central obstacle keeping the Strait of Hormuz close-ed, and did it in a way that shifted the balance of power in the Middle East more permanently than anything that has happened in this conflict so far. The communication that ended the Strait of Hormuz crisis did not come from Washington. It did not come from the Pakistani mediation team whose four-component demand framework had been the operational diplomatic instrument for managing every previous IRGC interception incident since the ceasefire framework took effect. It did not come from any of the channels that the American national security apparatus had been working through in the 48 hours following the Minerva Luna's 0431 radar contact with 4 IRGC patrol vessels. The most bizarre headline of this entire war is the one that nobody seems to have noticed is bizarre. Donald Trump, the president who spent 6 weeks demanding that Iran open the Strait of Hormuz, who threatened to blow up the whole civilization if Iran did not open the Strait of Hormuz, who sent J.D. Vance to Pakistan for 21 hours specifically to get Iran to agree to open the Strait of Hormuz, just announced that the United States will be blockading the Strait of Hormuz. Trump is blockading the strait that he demanded Iran open. Iran is the country that everyone said was blockading the strait that Trump demanded Iran open. And now both of them are blockading it simultaneously. CNN Business captured the paradox with unusual bluntness. Trump is threatening to close off a strait that he has repeatedly told Iran must be reopened unconditionally. This is the moment the war logic completed its inversion. Iran closed Hormuz. America is now closing Hormuz. The question of who opens it and on whose terms. It is what 43 days of war, 1 ceasefire, and 1 21-hour failed negotiation in Pakistan have produced. And at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday, April 13th, the American blockade begins. On April 11th, 2026, at a moment when J.D. Vance was sitting across a table from Abbas Araghchi in Islamabad, and the whole world was watching whether diplomacy would produce a settlement, 2 American warships did something that had not happened since the first bomb fell on February 28th. They turned on their automatic identification systems. Not by accident. You do not throw AIS on by accident on a Navy ship. That is the judgment of Campbell University professor Salvatore Marcoliano, who specializes in military and maritime history. It is purposeful.